Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us and for being so prompt. I know that, in our new or, not so new Zoom world, Zoom fatigue is real and it's a really nice day outside. So we really appreciate you logging on and sharing your Zoom boxes or, Zoom name with us, even though it's such a nice day out. And we're really excited to be a part of Affordable Housing Month and really get to share more about the connection between our climate crisis and our housing crisis and how we can address these issues simultaneously. My name is Siegel, and I am the Director of Climate Resilience at Greenbelt Alliance. For those of you who are not familiar with Greenbelt Alliance, we're an environmental nonprofit that works across the Bay Area to educate, advocate, and collaborate to ensure the Bay Area's lands and communities are resilient to a changing climate. Hold on. Okay. Thought I wasn't recording this for a moment. Well, Greenbelt Alliance works across our region. I live in the East Bay on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo Native people. And as we talk about our housing and climate justice issues today, I really want to make sure that we recognize the Native populations who were the first inhabitants of this land. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence that has been inflicted upon the Indigenous people of our lands and across California and the Americas. I'm also very excited to be joined here today with Allison Chan, the Political Director of Save the Bay, Aaron Eckhouse, the Regional Policy Director for California YIMBY, and Pedro Galvao, the Policy Director of the Nonprofit Housing Association. They'll each talk a little bit more about who they are and what they do in a moment, so I'll leave further instructions to them. I can see that there's a lot of collective wisdom in this Zoom room as well, and so I want to make sure that we're taking advantage of what everyone else knows here. And if you have any questions for the panelists or myself, feel free to add them in the Q&A box. Or I would also love to encourage people to use the chat feature to share information and your own wisdom throughout the webinar. And if I see people are already doing this, but if you could take a moment right now to really introduce yourself in the chat and where you're from, we would love to get to know you and make this as engaging as a Zoom webinar a year and a half into Zoom life possibly can be. Great, yeah, welcome everyone. Love that we're seeing so many people from different places across the region and even outside of the Bay Area. And this is a really critical moment for having this conversation because, we've officially rejoined the Paris Climate Accords, and the Biden administration is working to rebuild and repair some of the environmental destruction of the previous administration. Governor Newsom's budget this year includes large amounts of funding for clean energy, carbon sequestration, fire resilience, and more. The state legislative agenda has more bills than I've ever seen before around climate resilience, environmental protection, infill housing, and clean energy. But we need to address our climate crisis from all angles. The state and hopefully new federal legislation is wonderful, but we can't just take a top-down approach and wait for state regulations to make our communities more resilient. In order to fast-track our climate goals, we need to work at the regional and local levels to make sure the right climate policies are in place. And this means we need to really make the connection between our housing crisis and our climate crisis. In California, 40% of climate pollution comes from transportation, and the bulk of that are from gasoline and diesel burning cars on the road. In some counties, as much as 2/3 emission are from cars. Building more housing in the right places can mitigate climate impacts and reduce housing costs and inequalities. But in order to do this, we need to change the way we build. And as we encourage and engage in equitable, fire-safe infill development, it's really important that we think about how we can maximize these benefits that we're getting from our land. We need to build more infill housing in existing urban areas, but that housing and all housing needs to include a healthy amount of green infrastructure like biosoils or carbon sequestering trees that can provide a tree canopy and mitigate urban heat island effect. And there's ways to do this at the regional level, the state level, and local ways that we can advocate and implement these changes that need to happen. At the local level, the housing element process has become increasingly important as the state continues to face a major housing shortage. And as every city in the region gears up to update their housing element, this is a really critical moment where we need to support the right kinds of infill safe housing in the right locations, which could include zoning for more housing in low fire risk areas in existing communities. Regionally, all panelists and I have been working closely on advocacy around Plan Bay Area 2050, our long-range plan that really charts the course for the future of our 9-county, Bay Area region. And Plan Bay Area is divided into 4 key issues that our region is grappling with: the economy, the environment, housing, and transportation. But as we think about our priorities for the region, we need to really make sure that we strike a balance between all of these issues and come up with multi-benefit solutions for addressing these overlapping issues, because there's only so much funding for implementing all of these things. As we really consider our goals for the region, I think we can all agree that we really want to strive to make the Bay Area more affordable, resilient, and have safe, healthy communities. But there's different ways of getting there. And now more than ever, the housing and environmental partners really need to come together to advocate for a shared vision for the region. Luckily, there's so many overlapping environmental and housing priorities at all levels of government. And simply allowing for more people to live in the Bay Area is one of the clearest ways for reducing our climate impacts across the region. But not all housing is created equal. Today, Allison, Aaron, Pedro, and I will dive into the housing and climate connection and what types of housing we as a region need to build in order to really create these healthy, safe, resilient communities. And now I will hand it over to Aaron.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you so much for putting this panel together. Thank you to ALC for Affordable Housing Month, and it's great to be here with so many great housing advocates. My name is Aaron Eckhouse. I'm the Regional Policy Manager with California YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard. We're a statewide policy advocacy group dedicated to advancing solutions to California's housing crisis so we can make sure the state is truly a place for everyone. I'm really excited to be talking about this issue. The link between climate and housing is how I got into housing politics, thinking about this question of how do we create sustainable, walkable, rollable, transit-oriented communities where people aren't dependent on a car for their daily mobility needs, and encountering the land use barriers that make that difficult today. The good news is I think those are solvable problems. So at California YIMBY, we've been strong advocates from as long as I've been here for transit-oriented development as a way to both address our housing crisis in a way that also advances our climate goals and allows people to live without needing a car to commute and go about their daily lives. We know that allowing people to live near transit, it makes the most out of those transit investments, and it gives them alternatives and options to commute and go and travel in a more sustainable way. We've also expanded that focus to think about not just transit-oriented development, but more broadly amenity-oriented development around access to jobs, schools, and other resources that people need in their daily lives. Because we know, there are a variety of sustainable modes of transportation in terms of putting people walking or biking distance from work, in terms of allowing their children to walk or bike to school, in terms of them having access to grocery stores and other key neighborhood amenities that will allow them to live that car-free or car-light life, and consistent with our climate goals and needs to reduce car dependence as we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We've been working on a number of policies for that at the state, regional, and local levels. And I think one of the things that we're most excited about that Zoe touched on is the upcoming housing element process. This is a process that's going to be underway over the next year in the Bay Area and is currently happening in other parts of the state, where every city is going to be required to lay out its plan for how to meet their housing goals as determined through a state and regional process, the regional housing needs allocation process. Every city gets a number of homes at different income levels, very low income, moderate income, and above moderate income, that the state is requiring them to plan for. And this is very exciting for us because it creates an impetus for cities to take more meaningful action on housing. I think all of us as housing advocates have encountered the situation of we recognize that there's a crisis and that we need to be changing our policies to address that. But the default for any level of government is too often inaction. And the great thing about the housing element process is it upends that. And the default now has to be action because there's a state mandate for cities to complete this planning process. That being said, cities also have a lot of leeway in terms of how they identify where they're going to meet those housing needs. And this is where, as advocates, it's really important for us to be involved and to be making sure that they're planning in a way that enable the supports transit-oriented development, that enables people to live near jobs and other amenities, that reverses historic patterns of segregation and exclusion, so that some of our most environmentally friendly neighborhoods, where we currently have great transit resources, great tree coverage, and great amenities, are open to people of all backgrounds and income levels. This is a process that's going to be playing out in your cities. If you're interested in it, I would encourage you to, one, check out the Fair Housing Elements campaigns. It's fairhousingelements.org. And also to get in touch with your city's planning department to let them know that this is a process you're interested in and you'd like to receive updates, because there's going to be opportunities going forward for public outreach and engagement. And there's a really exciting chance to participate in this process and to try to make sure that these plans as they move forward are including everyone in our communities and creating conditions for sustainable growth. We know that housing politics is a really powerful climate tool. The Cool Climate Lab at UC Berkeley has done analysis of this. In many cities around the Bay Area, the single most powerful thing that they can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in their community is simply to allow more infill housing, because these are communities that have really wonderful mild climates that don't require a lot of energy for heating and cooling. Actually, it was 2 years that I lived in the Bay Area before I even learned how to turn the heat on in my apartment. I just didn't need it. As well as communities where people, again, have transit access or close access to jobs. Like, think about a place like San Francisco or Berkeley, where I used to live. These are communities where they provide a lot of opportunities for people to live low carbon lifestyles. And that's actually without even getting into the potential benefits of infill housing for reducing vehicle miles traveled by allowing more compact development forms. We better support transit. We better support neighborhood retail that allows people to shop without getting into a car. I have a couple of corner stores within walking distance. It's the best quality of life thing for me. I can't imagine living without them. And that's the kind of thing that's possible because of the mixed scale development in my neighborhood, where we have not only single family homes, but plexes and different types of apartment buildings that support that kind of walkable retail. So yeah, I think there's a really exciting opportunity in the housing element process, and also some of the bills that are moving at the state level we can talk about later, to advance smart, climate-friendly growth patterns in California, and to reverse this pattern where the place people find affordable housing is out in the valley and the Delta, and they're forced to commute long distances every day in order to get to their jobs, which are here in the Bay Area core.
All right, thank you, Erin. Yeah, I think there are so many ways that we can, work together to build a more climate resilient neighborhoods. And next up, we'll have Allison.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here today. My name is Allison Chan. I'm the political director at Save the Bay. I've been at Save the Bay for about 11 years now, and excited to be a part of Affordable Housing Week and this panel. So I want to share a little bit about the perspective that we're bringing to this conversation. For those of you who may not be as familiar with Save the Bay as others, we're the largest regional organization working to protect, restore, and celebrate the San Francisco Bay, and to support communities throughout our region that are resilient and adapted to climate change. And as more and more over the last few years, our focus has shifted toward adaptation, climate adaptation in our communities, and what link that has to the health of the Bay and the ability for residents in our region to stay in the Bay Area and be advocates of the Bay. So it's sort of this dual issue of affordability and continuation of stewardship of the Bay in our region. But the reason why climate is such a high priority for us, in addition to the other work we do to restore tidal marsh in the Bay and protect ecological functions of the Bay, is because climate impacts are upon us today. And this past year has been a very stark reminder of that. Intense flooding from king tide events is a precursor to what we can expect with sea level rise and storm surges. The smoky skies and poor air quality from wildfires is only going to continue and probably worsen, and intense heat, which was such a horrible experience at the same time of the wildfires. So climate impacts are upon us, and in order to protect the health of the Bay, we also have to think about the health and resilience of our communities. So in particular, flooding is an issue our communities that are experiencing that has a solution that can also benefit the Bay. And that solution is sort of broadly known as green infrastructure. It can look like wetlands on the shoreline that help to protect shoreline infrastructure and homes from storm surges. But inland and away from the shoreline, it also kind of just looks like landscaping. But when you design that landscaping to have specific functions around climate resilience, it can help to reduce that flooding while also protecting the Bay from pollution, while also reducing our temperatures in our downtown areas where there's a lot of asphalt and concrete. And this is really important, not only for the overall resilience of our region to climate change and the resilience of the Bay to climate change, but also with an eye toward equity in our region. We know that the same areas and neighborhoods that are most susceptible to some of these climate impacts are also some of the most susceptible neighborhoods to displacement, or are already experiencing that to a painful degree. Low-income communities and communities of color face disproportionate threats from flooding, urban heat island, and water scarcity. And then these are the areas also experiencing housing shortages, affordable housing shortages, and displacement threats. So to address all of these threats, we need, again, a solution that both benefits our communities and benefits the Bay, and this green infrastructure can play that role. The key, the sort of message that I'm hoping to drive home today is that it's possible to address climate threats while also addressing these housing challenges, but that action is needed now. It's one thing to talk about it, and it's another thing to act on it. And one of the things that Save the Bay is doing, in addition to participating in these kinds of conversations and exploring the right approaches to this issue, is to enable and empower our elected officials at the local, state, and even federal levels to take action on this work, on this critical work, before it's too late. We don't want to wait for the next major climate disaster to decide that we need to create sustainable communities, protect our communities, especially neighborhoods with affordable housing, and especially neighborhoods with vulnerable and otherwise marginalized communities. So some of our current work has been really focused in the last few months in San Jose as they sort of tackle a lot of these issues. But we are looking regionally for opportunities to advance this work and to truly create communities that are Bay smart. In other words, climate resilient, and communities that can help to advance protection of the ecological and recreational functions of the Bay and its watershed. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Allison. And we completely agree that the compounding climate crisis and housing affordability crises have really disproportionately affected, low-income communities and communities of color, and generations of racial disparities in wealth that have been exacerbated by federally backed lending practices, have really resulted in the majority of single-family neighborhoods being white, and increasing the housing supply and including green infrastructure in future developments is a really powerful tool to address housing affordability and racial segregation while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But next up, I would like to introduce Pedro.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Zoe, for the opportunity to present. And thank you, HLC, for organizing this great event. My name is Pedro Galvão, and I'm Policy Director at the Nonprofit Housing Association in Northern California. We are an affordable housing advocacy organization whose mission it is to build a Bay Area where everyone has a stable and affordable place to call home. We represent affordable housing developers who build in all 9 Bay Area counties. We also represent city housing departments and folks who want the Bay Area to be a more affordable place to call home. We fully agree, and I fully agree with the previous panelists that infill housing is a great solution to help address the climate crisis, especially here in the Bay Area, where we are blessed with a climate that is more stable, where we don't need heat or AC as much, and our organization. I'm sorry, I hear somebody talking. I'm not sure. Okay. I'll just keep going if folks can still hear me. So, but as I was saying, we really do believe in infill housing as a critical solution, infill affordable housing as a critical solution to the climate crisis, especially if you think about who is getting displaced from our cities and our neighborhoods. These are low-income families who don't have the resources to stay in our region. And they're the ones who are more likely to drive to work, to drive an older car, contributing to congestions, higher GHG emissions. They're also likely to live somewhere that is less climate friendly than the Bay Area, where they are going to be making use of that heater or that AC. And so we fully believe that infill, especially affordable housing, is a critical climate solution. And so we have been focused this year on just getting more, as in general, but getting more affordable housing built in our region by focusing on three main ingredients of affordable housing. They say you need land, money, and political will. And I'm going to share with you a couple of slides just on some of the challenges that we're facing. One of the major challenges that our Bay Area is facing in building affordable infill housing is just lack of federal resources. Our state and many of our counties have dedicated significant amounts of local money that is then paired with federal money. And our state is running out of that federal money. In fact, our state is oversubscribed 3-to-1 for those federal resources. And so as a result, we have 10,000 deeply affordable units up and down in our state, about 6,000 of which are here in the Bay Area that are stalled because of lack of federal resources. And if we had those resources, those units would be under construction right now. At the same time, because we lack federal resources, the state has set up a framework to decide who gets funding and who doesn't. And this regulatory framework has de-emphasized building in infill areas in cities. Because those types of developments tend to be more expensive, the state is looking to fund affordable housing that is cheaper, often in areas that are sprawl and do not have the same benefits of TOD infill affordable housing in our cities. And to complicate matters even more, we're facing a very difficult legislative environment this year due to opposition from key stakeholder groups in the Capitol that have a lot of influence, that are looking to expand their footprint on affordable housing construction. And I can get more on that. I can give more on that later. And so our organization is focused on getting us more resources through funding for homelessness service and prevention. We're also looking to convert properties whose homeowners, second homes, whose homeowners can no longer pay their taxes that become tax delinquent into affordable housing while keeping any existing tenants housed. We're looking to get significant new resources to continue providing housing and services for people experiencing homelessness, as well as resources for affordable housing production. So 20 billion focused on homelessness and 13 billion focused on affordable housing production. We're also looking to preserve existing affordability in our cities. Most cities have apartments that are charging below market rate rents, but are not capital A affordable. That is, while they're charging below market rate rents, those units could at any moment flip to charge market rate, and those tenants could be displaced. So we're looking to buy those units and convert them into permanent affordable housing. We're also making the case pretty strongly that the state needs to fund affordable housing here in the Bay Area, especially infill affordable housing in our cities. And we've also been focused on the federal government. There's an infrastructure package that the Biden administration is proposing that we think will make transformational investments in green infrastructure and affordable housing. And we also want to increase the amount of federal resources that our region has available through the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. So I gave you all quite a bit to chew on, but this is just the flavor of both the challenges and the opportunities that we see this year to address our housing crisis. And now I will turn it back over to Zoe. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Pedro. And I'd like to invite all of our panelists back to the Zoom stage. And I think just to get the conversation going, I'm curious. So all of our organizations have articulated a vision for a denser, greener, more affordable region, but sometimes these goals are in direct conflict of each other. How do we choose, what to prioritize, and what are these choices that we're weighing against each other, and then who bears the burden of these costs? So maybe I'll start off with Pedro.
Sure, and thank you for that question, Zoe. I'd say that we're facing this challenge right now at the state level. We lack enough federal resources to allocate across the state. And so the state is asking itself the question of, okay, how can we maximize these resources? Well, we can maximize our existing resources and build the highest number of affordable housing by targeting those projects that are cheaper to build. And cheaper to build usually means less green, in sprawl locations where cost to build is cheaper. And what NPH is making the case for right now is that we really do need to continue these climate investments in infill affordable housing in our cities. And that just because our cities are more expensive places to build, that doesn't mean that they're not worthy of investment. And so we're focused on creating an affordable housing regulatory or funding framework that can really ensure that we can continue to build infill affordable housing. And we're also, in looking at regulations more broadly, trying to make the case that we can hit our climate goals and hit various other public benefit goals as long as we can balance them out. And so it might be that we promote all electric buildings in certain cities that are really able to do that immediately. But and we also make sure that all developers can get up to the state the state green codes and making sure that those developments are working well and, figuring out a longer term track. But we don't believe in the approach of, well, this affordable housing costs a little bit more, therefore let's not fund any affordable housing development in San Francisco, Oakland, or San Jose. True story, actually happened in January. And so that's what we're fighting against.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think, it's definitely possible to meet the every city's housing goals and their new numbers from the regional housing needs assessment process, while still, protecting open spaces like, wetlands and, large open spaces. And that's one of the best ways. One of the best ways to do that really is to build affordable housing. And so I think one of the best ways to really, balance all these priorities is to think about the, multi-benefit solutions. Allison, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, thank you. I 100% agree that the focus should be on infill development and putting affordable housing near transit. And I'm going to focus more of my comments on the greening aspects, but because my colleagues here on the panel can speak so much to infill, but I want to make it clear that that's an important approach that we support. And layered on top of that are these greening priorities. So, I think in terms of the questions of how do we choose what to prioritize, our view, which continues to evolve and we're learning from you all about how best to approach this, but our view is that you have to prioritize climate adaptation in our most vulnerable communities, that if they are protected and adapted and resilient, then the rest of us, then everyone will be better off. And then the flip side is if we don't focus on our most vulnerable communities, which can be defined in so many different ways, then we can't call our region sustainable. And so more specifically, I think when it comes to balancing all of these needs around resilience versus affordability, 100% building new housing and preserving existing affordable housing is critically important. And what we're encouraging decision makers to keep in mind is that the investments that are necessary to improve and protect our region's housing stock will be lost if we fail to protect that housing from flooding and other climate impacts. We don't want those investments to go down the drain. And it's easy to say that this is an issue that's several years off, but again, looking at the last year, everything we've all endured, it's not. And these investments are necessary now. So that's sort of the big picture of how we're encouraging decision makers to think about this, is protecting your investment in housing by also acknowledging and incorporating the resilience pieces. The cost of rebuilding after disasters is exorbitant. So, when you think about cost, yes, upfront costs are painful. If we can find creative strategies for funding, we can avoid the costs of cleaning up a mess later. So we think that one of the approaches that are important to getting toward this balance is planning for greening elements and affordable housing in really community-oriented processes. We are not fans of going into a community and saying, you need this, here you go, here's how you create resilience. We certainly have ideas and we have examples that we can share from other parts of the Bay Area and regions outside of our out of the Bay. And we are working to be part of community-driven processes around the region to identify ways to build housing in a way that's going to be resilient, again, incorporating greening elements and also incorporating those greening elements outside of the development, but in the surrounding community. I don't think that this priority should be addressed solely by developers and those involved directly in a project. The public right-of-way around these developments is also a critically important area and great opportunity for incorporating climate resilience and urban greening. And so there should be this sort of dual responsibility between local agencies, developers, and all the nonprofits involved in trying to advance these housing solutions to ensure that resilience is part of the conversation from the very beginning. And so, that's, I think, one way, this sort of inclusive, a holistic planning process to listen to the needs of the community, to incorporate local agencies, and to think creatively about funding is super important. And I'll just say one more thing with respect to balancing these needs. I think also what we learned from the past year is that green spaces are critically important for people to be able to access directly from their homes. There are so many neighborhoods in our region that don't have a green space within a 10-minute walk. And at a time when being outside was the safest thing for us to do, those of us who had that access, it saved our sanity. And those of us who didn't continued to suffer in a lot of different ways. So the reason why I bring that up is, the solutions that Save the Bay advocates for, we're specifically interested in them being multi-benefit. We want them to help reduce, these climate impacts, specifically flooding. When you have green areas, it can soak up rainwater and reduce flooding. Similarly, on the shoreline, if you have wetlands, it can help reduce flooding from storm surges. But these areas, particularly in our urban centers, can also reduce heat island effect, which is something we all experienced to such a large degree over the last year. And these green spaces, because they're basically increasing dirt and decreasing asphalt, also help to clean pollution out of rainwater before it reaches the bay. So it's benefiting the bay, it's benefiting public health, it's benefiting, it's improving climate resilience, and it's creating recreational opportunities and access to green space that we think is so important. So, I'm sort of indirectly answering the question, but I think these are all of the priorities and ways of tying these issues together that we are thinking about and grappling with. And I think as long as the conversation continues to be holistic in this way, we can start working toward more creative solutions. And I'll touch on funding in a little while. I'll stop talking for a minute.
Great, thank you, Allison. Aaron?
Yeah, so one, I think continuing to talk with one of those organizations and do coalition building there is obviously critically important. We have a lot of shared goals and that we're going to be much more able to accomplish if we're in a united front. Some of the things we're asking for are really politically challenging. And so to the extent that we can be pushing for them together, we're going to be much more able to accomplish them. I think the other thing that's critical from my perspective is doing whatever we can to free ourselves from a scarcity mindset and the constraints of scarce resources whenever possible. Because when we have that scarcity mindset, we get into these really high stakes distributional conflicts that are really challenging to resolve. So if we have a limited number of transit-rich neighborhoods and we have a limited amount of housing in those neighborhoods. So then we get into this really intense discussion. Well, do we need affordable, capital A affordable housing near transit because low-income residents are the people who are most likely to ride transit? Do we need market rate housing near transit because high-income residents are the most likely to change their behavior if they move near transit? And the answer is that we need both. And they don't have to be in conflict with one another. But if we get caught in that scarcity framework, we'll pit them against one another and we'll undermine our ability to achieve either. Now, sometimes there is real scarcity, there's a real scarcity in terms of funding available for dedicated affordable housing in California. And that sets up these issues that Pedro touches on, where affordable housing in one place comes at the expense of affordable housing somewhere else. And it's needed everywhere. And so that is where something like the federal infrastructure package and the ability to get a really transformative amount of new financial resources available to support things like affordable housing and transit and green infrastructure become critical, because that can free us from these scarcity constraints that pit us against one another and allow us to all get the things that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, scarcity and, how we fund all of these initiatives is definitely a big question. And I think that's why, the multi-benefit solutions that Allison and everyone, today has talked about are ultimately so critical. And I think, as we think about sort of the limited funding, it does present other challenges. And so I think my next question for everyone really is, what are some of these challenges related to addressing both the dual housing and climate crises? And also sort of start to add in some questions from the audience as we go along. And I think, connected to this, Noelle asked, how do we merge the climate and housing priorities so that climate activists aren't opposing new housing projects in the Bay Area? And, from my perspective, I think that really is one of our big challenges, is we have these sort of competing advocates that really are fighting for these critical issues, and now is the time to really come together and advocate for these this shared vision. And I think it's hard to know exactly with every situation is different, but I think one of the key ways to really do that is to overcome the stigma around multifamily housing and upzoning in different communities, because I think there's a lot of communities where there is a lot of concern around adding in more density and how that will affect their parking or just the neighborhood feel. And I think overcoming something like that will actually increase increase the walkability and have a number of health benefits for the region. Okay, so how about this time I will ask Allison first. What challenges do you see with these combining issues?
Yeah, so I think I'll address funding here with some thoughts that we have. Certainly don't have any fast solutions, but here are our thoughts. One thing I think is important for us to start doing, and by us, it's the agencies and decision makers that are ultimately going to be grappling with permitting and approving projects, is to take a new approach to thinking about what the cost of a project is, whether it's in the public right of way or on private development. When you think about a project more holistically in terms of the benefits down the line of investing upfront in some of these resilience elements like greening, which do increase the cost initially, what you're avoiding down the line are the costs associated with flooding to your infrastructure, with the costs of heating and cooling in an area with very little vegetation and tree canopy. And the benefit, which is hard to quantify, but as we all know, is so important, of access to green space. So if we can start finding I'm not an economist, thank goodness, but if we can start finding a way to monetize these benefits and think about them in a more direct way, incorporate them in a more direct way into the analysis of potential projects that might look expensive when you incorporate resilience elements, then we can start to think about what the important investments really are, and whether or not upfront costs are worth it to avoid serious costs down the line. So I think I'm advocating for a new way of thinking about project planning that incorporates that. The other side of it is just on the ground, how do we help change the funding equation? And that's definitely one way, one area that Save the Bay is looking to focus in on. How do we tap into new sources of funding that can support some of this resilience work, and allow the funding that has been dedicated, the not enough funding that has been dedicated for affordable housing, to be kept focused on the housing development itself. And one area of focus has been in transportation funds. So again, this would be focused more on the public right-of-way areas around housing developments and private developments, but still critically important as a part of this conversation. Unfortunately, what we know from talking to our friends that work for local government is that often transportation funds make it difficult to include greening and other resilience elements into a project proposal. And you run the risk of not getting access to that funding if you include those elements. That seems backwards. That seems not the direction we want to go right now. We want to make sure that if roads, for example, are being reconstructed or renovated as part of a big development that's going into place, that the people moving into that development are also going to experience a revamped public space that has tree canopy, that has landscaping that can create these, that can contribute to these resilience functions like flood attenuation and reducing heat. So let's think about how to change our regional and state and federal funding criteria to make it so that cities, in particular, local governments that are doing the good work to incorporate these elements aren't getting dinged for it. If our state and federal government are saying they want to support this, that's one way they can do so. So that's the other thing I think we should be focusing on, and that's another area of advocacy for Save the Bay. So we've been going out there and trying to support local government as they advocate for these changes to funding opportunities as well. And more work to be done there, but that's where we're looking.
Great, thank you, Allison. Pedro, what challenges do you see that we face?
I think going back to what Aaron was saying, we need to think bigger and bolder to really begin addressing our crisis. At NPH, we think about the solutions that we can advance in the near term, but we always try to keep our eye on the prize of some of the systemic changes that we really need to fundamentally address our housing crisis. I think bottom line is we need to actually make housing development and affordable housing development feasible within our urban footprint. And we need to begin to do that by addressing the systemic racism that has in the housing system in California that has disproportionately benefited wealthier, whiter homeowners, like Prop 13. We need to address the issue of single family zoning and how it intentionally keeps out less affluent Black and Brown Californians from home ownership. And we need major ongoing funding for infill affordable housing, like we fund streets and roads. Collectively, the state is okay, and I think it's great that we are okay with investing $5 billion a year on maintaining our state's roads. And we need to look at affordable housing as infrastructure in much the same way. There is currently no ongoing funding that at the same scale. And we need a coherent state policy and vision that brings all of these parts together. And, as Allison and Aaron said, collaboration between organizations, I think, is important, especially given that housing has become so siloed. And it's like, no, I only work on homelessness solutions pertaining to people who need services, or I only work on affordable housing targeting extremely low income people, or, and it's so on and so forth. And it gets down to even smaller micro silos within that. But we need a full spectrum of solutions. It's not as if we only tackle homelessness, we're going to somehow take care of the full housing crisis. We need solutions from people who need services, who are experiencing homelessness, all the way through the middle class who is priced out of home ownership. And these are different solutions. They don't look the same. And we need to think through what are some of these bold systemic changes, beginning with our tax system, our zoning, and the resources that we dedicate to make all of this happen. I'll leave with just a great example of doing this, which is the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program. It's funding from the state's cap and trade program that's invested in affordable housing near transit that has all of these locational benefits. And that's a great example of something that a program that shows us how we can bring our respective communities together around a proactive solution that addresses multiple goals and is trying to bring forward that bigger, bolder vision.
Thank you, Pedro. And I want to be mindful of time and make sure that we are able to answer a few questions from the audience as well. But I also, wanted to touch on, as I mentioned before, this legislative session has a number of really exciting bills that are moving forward related to infill housing and making, our neighborhoods denser and more climate friendly. And Aaron, what are some notable bills that everybody should know about?
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. I think the most exciting bill for me from the perspective of the housing climate nexus is AB 1401. It's a bill from Assembly Member Laura Friedman from the Los Angeles area that would remove minimum parking requirements for housing, retail, and commercial development near high quality transit. This is something it's completely backwards towards our priorities around both affordable housing and sustainability, that we require parking, often 1 or 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit, often more square feet of parking for a restaurant than actual space within the restaurant under a lot of local rules. It's completely backward to be requiring that, sometimes literally on top of a subway station. So we know there was a recent study in San Francisco that the availability of on-site parking was actually a better predictor than proximity to transit in terms of how likely residents were to drive versus avail themselves of San Francisco's excellent public transit system. And so we know that when we have more parking, that makes people less likely to take transit, in which we've invested a lot of money. It makes them more likely to drive. That is an issue for climate change, for local air pollution, for traffic safety. And it drives up the cost of that development, makes the housing more expensive because you're requiring an expensive amenity like on-site parking to be bundled with it. So that's a bill that I think has a lot of potential to address all of these issues. And we're really excited to see it move forward.
Yeah, we're also very excited to see it move forward. And, reforming our parking policy can really increase the housing affordability and, address climate resilience by, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and, single occupancy trips. We can, also reduce air pollution and, add more bicycle infrastructure and really build these healthy, resilient communities. Okay, now I'm going to pivot and answer. We're going to go to a few questions from the audience. And Nathan asks, when discussing infill affordable housing for some neighborhoods, opponents will sometimes invoke the wildland-urban interface and the wildfire risk or sea level rise as a reason to not put more housing in these areas. How do you think about evaluating neighborhoods for infill when you bear these concerns in mind? And that's definitely a big issue. And, in planning commission or city council meetings across the region, that's definitely something that has come up time and time again and is a big concern. And recently, California YIMBY, Greenbelt Alliance, and Spur released a joint statement on development in the WUI, which I can share. But I think, and that's one of the key reasons why we really want to advocate for, more infill housing in non-wildfire prone areas so that we can, alleviate some of the pressure on the development in the wildland-urban interface. And I think, every organization, has different understandings or, beliefs or knowledge of how we should be developing in the wildland-urban interface. And I think this is an area that's constantly evolving, but really, as long as we make sure that we're not building, we're not building in the open spaces and keeping those open for, as wildfire barriers, and making sure that we're, developing more housing in the urban areas is a really key way to mitigate wildfire. Does anyone else have thoughts about this question?
Yeah, I'll just say this is something that we are looking into as a priority for ongoing engagement at California YIMBY over the next year, both in terms of we'll be working in coalition on this. We'll be doing research and policy development on this. We're going to be monitoring bills in the state legislature on this because this is, I think, a critical issue. It doesn't make sense to be continuing to sprawl into areas that we know are going to burn. But at the same time, we have to give people somewhere else to go. We can't just say, oh, you can't live there. And also you can't live in this neighborhood because we like it the way it currently is. We have to give people some place to go. The California economy is growing. California's population is growing. Most of that population growth, contrary to popular perception, is coming the old-fashioned way through Californians having children. And that next generation of Californians, they need homes. So if we're not going to be building those homes in the forests and the hills and the Delta and the other environmentally sensitive areas, we have to be building them in already developed areas within our cities, because we can't just tell people, no, sorry, no homes for you, better luck in Texas. That's not a sustainable or humane response.
Definitely. Okay, so we are running out of time. I'm so sorry we can't answer all of the great questions that are in the Q&A. After this, we'll try to sort through and answer some of them and provide them in the chat and the email follow-up. But I like to end webinars on a more positive note. I think we've touched on a lot of heavy but important issues today. And I'd like to ask all of our panelists, what's something that you're excited or, inspired about in the year to come related to this topic? And let's start with Pedro.
Yes, I'm excited by the fact that it seems like the pandemic, while it's been absolutely devastating and really heightened our existing humanitarian housing disaster, it has also helped us think bigger, more boldly, and more kindly. I think about the national evictions moratorium and the state evictions moratorium and how those would have been unthinkable years ago. I think about the level of resources that are being invested and the Biden administration calling for massive expansion of affordable housing as well as green infrastructure. And I'm really encouraged by that. I think that now is the time to think big and put forward these really bold solutions that will address these issues from a systems level. And that's what makes me feel inspired right now.
Thank you, Pedro. Aaron, what inspires you?
I think one thing that's very inspiring for me is the amount of progress that in just the last couple of years has been made in the understanding of housing issues and people's willingness to recognize the need for change in our approach. I think 3 years ago, when I first started working at California YIMBY, most California politicians still regarded single-family exclusive zoning as sacrosanct, and they were not willing to accept the idea that we would have to change that to address our housing needs in a sustainable way. And this year, we've seen a number of cities from Sacramento to San Jose to Santa Monica who are all pursuing changes at the local level. There's a robust discussion around change at the state level, and even at the federal level. We see the Biden administration talking about pushing cities to remove these sort of exclusionary barriers in neighborhoods that have been set up to keep people out and maintain restrictions on who can live where. So I think the pace of that change is very inspiring to me, and it makes me hopeful that in the next couple of years, we will see changes in policy to match.
I agree. Allison, what inspires you?
Well, all of the above. But also I think similarly, we saw over the past year how quickly things that could never change and we can't do that and that's going to take 5 years changed instantly. Do we not all have greater access to working from, well, I shouldn't say all, but many of us have been afforded greater access to flexible working arrangements. Systems that could never have become digitized are now digitized suddenly. So if we really want to make something happen, we can do it. And I think we have to harness that, that power and leadership that made these critical changes happen, and put that toward this issue. And I think that we have another thing that makes me, hopeful is that we have some good examples to build on. In the Bay Area, there are wonderful examples of affordable housing developments and housing developments at all levels that are infill, that have integrated greening, that have integrated all of these green building elements, and that are truly resilient. And let's incentivize more of that to happen. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's learn from the good work we've done, both to advance solutions and be creative, and keep that moving despite political challenges moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with everything that each of you have said as far as, what inspires you. And, I think as long as we, try to implement these multi-benefit solutions, we really do need to break down these silos and really work together. And, one of the things I'm really inspired by is all of these collaborations and partnerships with all of the organizations that are on this call and others, to really come together and, work with both the housing and environmental organizations to advocate really for this shared vision. So I wish we could, continue this conversation. And I know that we will be continuing this conversation offline, with all of you as we continue to work together. But I'd really like to, thank Erin, Allison, and Pedro for joining us today, and for everyone who's able to stick around and share this conversation with us. I really look forward to, continuing to work at the state, regional, and local levels to create a more equitable, resilient region. Sorry for any audio issues. I think it might be a Zoom issue. But for those of you who missed it or weren't able to hear me, we will be sharing a recording of this webinar, or if you'd like to share it with others. And so with that, I will let everyone go, and just wanted to thank everyone and thank HLC for hosting Affordable Housing Month and creating these opportunities for conversations. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.